When I study Putin's behavior, I see a man desperately clinging to an empire that history has already judged. He blames NATO expansion, but this is classic misdirection, a sophisticated gaslighting operation that has fooled far too many Western analysts. The truth is simpler and more damning. Russia has been an existential threat to its neighbors for centuries, systematically eliminating states that once existed. Countries don't rush into NATO because of Western conspiracies. They flee toward it because they remember what Russian occupation actually means. The Poles, the Balts, the Czechs, they've lived through the reality of Russian protection. The forced relocations, the summary executions, the economic exploitation disguised as socialist brotherhood. Putin isn't responding to NATO expansion. He's the reason it exists, and every Russian tank that rolls across a border proves this point again. Xi Jinping learned the most important lesson from Gorbachev's failure: never give people a choice. When the Soviet leader tried to reform communism, he discovered that democracy and empire simply don't mix. Give minorities a vote, and they'll vote to leave. Give people elections, and they'll choose multiple parties. The Communist Party's track record of incompetent economic management, summary executions, and famines becomes impossible to defend once people can speak freely. What terrifies Beijing today is the same thing that destroyed Moscow in 1991, the moment people stopped believing in the system. This explains China's genocide against the Uyghurs, their systematic destruction of Tibetan culture, and their absolute refusal to allow Hong Kong any real autonomy. They watched the USSR fragment along ethnic lines and said, never again. Every self-immolation in Tibet, every protest in Hong Kong represents their deepest nightmare, the awakening of subject peoples who no longer accept Han domination. The Soviet template for expansion was brutally effective, and we're seeing echoes of it today in places like Belarus and Kazakhstan. Control the defense and interior ministries, and you monopolize force, eliminate opposition through imprisonment or worse. Control justice and information, and you control the narrative. Arrest dissidents at will while ensuring their stories never reach the public. Control agriculture, and you buy loyalty through land redistribution, wiping out class enemies, collaborators, and the original rural elite in one stroke. The Russians perfected this in Eastern Europe after 1945, taking advantage of the absolute turmoil that wars create and leveraging their massive Red Army presence. The irony was staggering: the greatest imperial power of the 20th century, positioning itself as the liberator from imperialism, even as Western imperialists were voluntarily giving up their colonies. They maintained democratic forms while gutting democratic substance, keeping Poland as Poland while ensuring it was anything but independent. Today's authoritarians still use this playbook, just with different terminology and more sophisticated propaganda techniques. What keeps me awake at night is watching both Russia and China turn to jingoistic nationalism as their last source of legitimacy. When communist economics failed spectacularly, when religious authority collapsed under the weight of atheistic ideology, when rational governance became impossible due to corruption and incompetence, they reached for the most dangerous drug of all: militant nationalism. After the Tiananmen massacre, the Chinese Communist Party decided to rewrite all the textbooks, shifting focus from class enemies to evil Japanese and evil Americans. It's intoxicating, it's unifying, and it's ultimately destructive. Nationalism clouds judgment, making leaders believe their own propaganda about civilizational superiority. It alienates minorities within the empire who have no interest in Han or Russian nationalism. It frightens neighbors into coordinating with each other and seeking powerful allies to counterbalance the threat. Most dangerously, it makes de-escalation of international crises nearly impossible. How do you back down when your entire legitimacy depends on projecting strength? Both Putin and Xi are playing with fire, and the rest of us may get burned in the conflagration they're creating. People misunderstand what Putin really wants. This isn't just about Ukraine or NATO. It's about reversing what he sees as the greatest catastrophe of the 20th century, the collapse of the Soviet Empire. Look at the pattern. He comes to power during the Second Chechen War, leveling Grozny and turning most of Chechnya into an environmental wasteland. Then Georgia in 2008, detaching South Ossetia and Abkhazia while the world was distracted by the Olympics. When he eliminates term limits in 2012, which proves unpopular, he solves the problem by walking off with 7% of Ukrainian territory in 2014 at very little cost, and Russians think it's brilliant. He's methodically trying to rebuild Russian imperial control, one piece at a time, testing Western resolve with each escalation. The tragic irony is that by pursuing this impossible dream, he's ensuring Russia's long-term decline. While he dumps everything into Ukraine, leaving his military dangerously exposed, Siberia lies wide open to Chinese ambitions. His imperial fantasies may well deliver him the Chinese yoke he most fears, the nightmare scenario where Russians become tax collectors for Beijing, just as they once served the Mongols. Continental empires have always faced the same fundamental problem. How do you maintain legitimacy without elections? The traditional answers, religious authority, economic prosperity, civilizational superiority, have all failed modern Russia and China. Russian orthodoxy isn't marketable internationally, and communism collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. What's left is raw territorial expansion and the promise that size equals strength. That vast territorial extent somehow guarantees security, but this is a dead end in the modern world. In our interconnected age, wealth comes from innovation and trade, not from controlling vast empty spaces filled with resentful minorities. The future belongs to societies that can adapt and create, not those that can only extract resources and intimidate neighbors. Russia measures its greatness in territorial extent and the ability to run roughshod over others, but this is extractive thinking, the legacy of the Mongol yoke, where elites became tax collectors rather than wealth creators. They've never learned to produce prosperity, they only know how to confiscate it from others. Russia has posed an existential threat to its neighbors forever. There are so many neighbors you have never heard of because they've disappeared from the pages of history, courtesy of the Russians. From medieval principalities like Novgorod the Great, the more progressive alternative that might have led Russia down a different path, to the Central Asian khanates of Crimea, Kazan, Astrakhan, Kokon, Khiva, and Bukhara. Then came the repeated vivisection of European neighbors, Ukraine, Poland, Lithuania, Sweden, and Finland, taking their territory one bite at a time. The pattern is always the same: eliminate competitors, absorb territory, and rewrite history to make it seem inevitable. The stampede into NATO after the Cold War wasn't conspiracy, it was collective memory. Eastern Europeans remember what Russian liberation actually meant: decades of occupation, purges, and economic exploitation disguised as socialist brotherhood. They remember the deportations, the forced collectivization, the deliberate famines. When people ask why Poland can't stand Russians, the answer lies in three partitions: genocide-laced occupation, and Stalin's insistence on moving their entire country 200 kilometers west, not exactly the normal thing to do to an ally. The Chinese face a conundrum that Xi Jinping understands perfectly. If you no longer believe the economic theories on which communism is based, how do you justify one-party rule? The Communist Party has tried to soldier on without solving that problem, learning carefully from Gorbachev's mistakes. Their takeaways are chilling. Deploy tanks against civilians without hesitation, focus only on economic reforms while avoiding political ones, and systematically eliminate minority identities that could become focal points for independence movements. This is their rationale for what's happening to the Uyghurs right now. Leonid Brezhnev was in power for 18 long years, collecting cars and non-performing allies across the Third World. This was about manifesting Russian power, but it was expensive, and he didn't have much of an economy to pay for it. When you look at oil prices, they're intimately connected with both the decline of the Soviet Union and the rise of Vladimir Putin. In the Soviet era, government budgets relied as much as 55% on energy revenues. When those prices collapsed, so did the empire. Gorbachev repeatedly said they couldn't live that way anymore, but his reforms killed the patient he was trying to save. What worries me most about the current moment is how both Moscow and Beijing have abandoned the old restraints. Putin has thrown away the Soviet rule against hot wars. Those veterans of World War II understood that wars are easy to start but hard to finish. They preferred proxies and let America tie itself down in Korea and Vietnam. But Putin has risen to power on a diet of direct military action: Chechnya, Georgia, Ukraine. Each success has emboldened the next gamble. Meanwhile, Xi has learned that survival requires prioritizing party control over economic efficiency, even when those choices depress growth. Both leaders have chosen political survival over their country's long term prosperity, and that makes them extremely dangerous.